across continents carrying rifles, grenades, and the myth of German military perfection. But hidden inside bread bags and mess tins of the Wehrmacht was another story, less heroic, far more disturbing. Behind every advance, every frozen trench, every ruined village, there was hunger, real hunger, the kind that stripped away discipline, dignity, even illusion. Because the food German soldiers ate in World War II was often rotten, stretched, ersatz, and sometimes barely edible. And as the war collapsed into chaos, those meals exposed a terrifying truth. Even the most feared army on earth could not escape decay from within. From a distance, Hitler's war machine looked invincible. Gray columns rolled across Europe with brutal precision, engines roaring, boots striking the ground like clockwork. Newsreels showed speed, discipline, order, but inside the mess tins and ration bags of the Wehrmacht was a reality far uglier than propaganda admitted. While the world remembers tanks and blitzkrieg, millions of German soldiers were fighting another war at the same time. A war against spoiled food, shrinking portions, freezing tins, disease, and the slow humiliation of hunger. Since there is a list at the end, each item in the list should be its own chunk. Media, rotten food in WW2 army ration, moldy bread and shrinking portions in mess kit, close-up of German soldier inspecting meager meal. A war against spoiled food, shrinking portions, freezing tins, disease, and the slow humiliation of hunger. Picture the front at dawn. Smoke hangs over a ruined village. A soldier opens his bread bag with frozen fingers, hoping for warmth, maybe coffee, maybe sausage. Instead, he finds stale black bread, greasy margarine, bitter ersatz coffee made from substitutes, and canned meat so uncertain in smell and texture that even starving men learn to distrust it. This was not the fuel of a flawless army. It was survival in discipline. Early in the war, Germany tried to feed its soldiers with the illusion of abundance. Official rations were calculated with military precision. Bread, meat, fats, potatoes, preserves, coffee substitutes. On paper, it seemed sufficient, even strong. But war is never lived on paper. Food had to cross mud, snow, shattered railways, partisan attacks, and vast distances. With every mile from Germany, the promise on the ration chart weakened. By the time supplies reached the Eastern Front, the arithmetic of feeding men had already begun to collapse. And that is where the real mystery begins. How did one of the most organized armies in modern history end up giving its soldiers meals so miserable that diaries and testimonies describe worm-ridden biscuits, watery soups with almost no nourishment, horse meat passed off as standard protein, and bread thickened with fillers that made it heavy, sour, and sometimes nearly indigestible? This was not simply bad cooking. It was something larger, something built into the structure of total war. Because, German soldiers did not eat from one stable system. Their food changed by rank, by front, by season, by status, and honestly, by how close the entire campaign was to disaster. A soldier in France in 1940 did not eat like one outside Moscow in winter, and neither ate like a starving survivor trapped in the ruins of Stalingrad. Some rear units scavenged, some elite formations received better supplies, but frontline infantry often lived inside a machine that could still deliver bullets more reliably than calories. That is why historians care deeply about wartime food. Food is never only food. It is energy, morale, class, logistics, empire, and truth. You can read an army's menu like an X-ray of its inner condition. And when we examine what German soldiers really ate, the picture becomes disturbing, not just because the meals were disgusting, but because they reveal a hidden rot already spreading through Hitler's empire. So the question is no longer whether the food was bad. The question is this: what did those rations reveal about the collapse beginning inside Nazi Germany itself? The deeper you look into Wehrmacht rations, the more the myth of German efficiency begins to crack. Because these meals were not disgusting by accident. They were the product of a vast, strained system trying to feed millions of men across deserts, forests, mountains, and frozen plains, while an entire continent burned. A German soldier's stomach was tied to rail lines, horse carts, captured farmland, factory output, and a regime that believed conquest itself could solve scarcity. When that belief failed, the ration tin became a record of collapse. At the center of this system was standardization. The army issued bread, preserved meat, soup mixes, fats, cheese, jam, and coffee substitutes designed for transport and endurance rather than comfort. There were field kitchens when conditions allowed, and these could provide hot meals, stews, soups, potatoes, or meat. But the further troops moved into hostile territory, the less reliable those kitchens became. Vehicles broke down, fuel ran short, roads vanished into mud. Winter sealed entire fronts in ice. Under those conditions, men often fell back on iron rations, emergency reserves meant for survival, not daily life. And that is where the taste of the war truly changed. Coffee was often not coffee at all, but roasted substitutes that delivered bitterness without warmth of spirit. Bread could arrive hard, damp, moldy, or bulked with lower quality ingredients as shortages intensified. Meat might come salted, canned, smoked, or unrecognizable. Margarine replaced butter. Fresh food disappeared first. Then variety vanished. Then dignity. Calories mattered more than flavor, and eventually even calories became uncertain. But the real mechanism was larger than logistics. Germany was fighting a resource war it could not fully sustain. Its armies consumed enormous quantities of grain, livestock, fats, and transport capacity. As the front expanded, the regime increasingly depended on seizure. Occupied territories were expected to feed the conquerors. Local populations were stripped, fields exploited, herds slaughtered, storehouses emptied. In some regions, German soldiers ate because someone else was forced not to. The ration system was not merely military planning, it was tied to plunder. Then came the Eastern Front, where distance and winter turned weakness into catastrophe. Supply columns stretched across landscapes so vast they seemed to swallow time itself. Food froze solid, horses died, rail gauges had to be changed, villages were burned or abandoned. What had once been a calculated ration became whatever could still be moved, cooked, traded, or stolen. Soldiers wrote of endless bread, then no bread, of hot soup, then nothing warm for days, of slaughtered horses becoming emergency food, of meals so repetitive and degraded they stopped feeling like meals at all. And then came the twist. Hunger did not merely weaken the body, it changed the mind. It eroded morale, sharpened cruelty, deepened fear, and exposed the lie that the Reich was built on strength. An army can hide many things behind uniforms and banners, but not for long behind an empty stomach. And by the time German soldiers were eating the taste of desperation, the war had already begun revealing a darker truth. This machine was not running out of food alone, it was running out of future. By the final years of the war, what German soldiers ate no longer reflected an organized military diet. It reflected disintegration. The great machine that had stormed across Europe was now feeding its men from ruins, scraps, frozen wagons, emergency slaughter, and fantasy. On collapsing fronts, A meal could become an accident of survival. A crust of dark bread split between exhausted men, thin soup stretched far beyond nourishment, canned meat of doubtful origin, turnips standing in for everything, and whatever could be seized from abandoned farms before artillery found the road again. This was no longer provisioning, it was erosion made edible. And nowhere was that truth more merciless than in encirclement and retreat. In places like Stalingrad, food ceased to be routine and became fate. Horses were butchered, bread rations shrank into symbols, warm meals disappeared into memory. Hunger entered the bloodstream of the army like another enemy, silent, patient, impossible to negotiate with. Men weakened, judgment faltered, disease spread faster, and the line between soldier and survivor began to vanish. War had stripped away ceremony. What remained was the primitive arithmetic of calories and death. But the disturbing implication is even larger than the menu itself. Because what German soldiers were eating was connected to what Nazi Germany was doing to the rest of Europe. The Reich's food system relied on hierarchy. Some people would eat better because others would eat worse, or not at all. Occupied land was exploited. Civilians were deprived. Prisoners were starved with deliberate cruelty. Entire populations were reduced to nutritional sacrifice beneath the priorities of conquest. So when we ask what German soldiers really ate, we are not only opening a ration tin, we are opening the moral structure of the regime that filled it. That is what makes this story bigger than disgust. The canned fat, the moldy bread, the bitter substitutes, the horse meat, the watery stew. These were not just ugly details from military history. They were physical evidence that the war machine was devouring everything around it, including itself. An empire built on violence eventually consumes its own body. First the conquered, then the supply lines, then the illusions, then the men in uniform who once believed they were marching inside history's most unstoppable force. And this is why food matters so much in war. Weapons tell us how armies kill. Food tells us how they endure, how they fail, and what they truly are beneath banners and speeches. A ration is never just nutrition. It is a confession. It reveals whether power is stable or desperate, whether order is real or staged, whether a civilization is sustaining life or feeding on destruction. In the end, German soldiers did not just taste bad food. They tasted the internal decay of the world they were fighting for. Beneath the steel, beneath the propaganda, beneath the myth of perfection, there was rot. And perhaps that is the final lesson of all collapsing empires. Long before they vanish from maps, they begin to disappear in the mouths of the men sent to defend them.